And lecture 22, considering the menstrual cycle. So we're on page 852. Notice figure 2231 takes up the entire page. And we'll be doing the A and the B parts, the upper and the middle parts. And then also on page 853, right next door, table 22.4. And we're going to be going back and forth between reading the events in the table and then looking at the events on the figure. Table 22.4 then. And before we get started, take just a minute and figure out what's going on with this figure on page 852. And so notice down at the bottom where it says figure 2231, and then it's talking about major events of the menstrual cycle. So that's what this whole thing is about. And you can see then A, plasma hormonal concentrations of FSH and LH. So if you go to the top of those two boxes, the boxes are marked A and B. If you go to the top of box A, then notice we're looking at concentrations of FSH and LH in the blood. Back to down below in the description then, and follicle maturation in and ovulation from the ovaries. And so here notice, if you take a look at the bottom part of box A, or a figure A, here you can see that we are following what's going on with the ovaries over this 28-day or so cycle. Back down to the description then at the bottom of the page. So B now, plasma hormonal concentrations of estrogen and progesterone. And so here, again, we're to the lower box, we're to the box labeled B, and the top of that box, you can see we're looking at estrogens and we're looking at progesterone. And if you just kind of follow through time, so left to right, you can see that these are undergoing changes. There are peaks, there are valleys. And then finally down to the bottom of the page again for a description, the box labeled B at the bottom is looking now at changes in the endometrium. So remember the endometrium, that inner lining of the uterus. And notice we do have some changes going on, largely in thickness of the wall of the uterus, of the endometrium over time. So with this, let's go ahead and start with table 22.4, number 1. So the anterior pituitary gland secretes FSH and LH. Upper left-hand part of the page then. Go ahead and find LH. Go ahead and find FSH. Number 2, from the table again, FSH stimulates the maturation of a dominant follicle. And so notice now, upper left area still, where we have FSH and then the arrow going down. And notice now, one follicle per cycle becomes a dominant follicle and becomes larger. And typically this is either in one ovary or another. So again, we have a dominant follicle starting to mature now. Number 3 then, don't worry about the granulosa cells as far as that term goes. And so number 3 then, just find where the follicle produces and secretes estrogens. And so now we're down to the B box, the lower box, and the upper part of that box. And notice now we're seeing estrogens being secreted. 3B, notice now estrogens cause the endometrium to thicken. And remember, the endometrium is the lower part of the lower diagram, the lower part of the B part of the diagram. And notice the endometrium now does start thickening at about the same point that estrogens are being secreted in higher concentrations. We get more thickening of the endometrium. By the way, I'm following through this fairly quickly, and I'd say instead of trying to jot all of this information down in your notes, it might be a good idea to just make a note to come back to table 22.4 and to come back to figure 22.31 and to again just work back and forth between those. And as we're doing now, just go down through the table and again find the corresponding things that are going on diagrammatically in the figure. So we were to the point then in 3b where estrogens were causing the endometrium to thicken. Notice number 4 then, the anterior pituitary releases a surge of LH. And so go back up to the upper part of the A box and notice about halfway over in terms of time. So at about 13 or 14 days of this 28-day cycle, notice we're seeing this surge of LH. Back to the table then, which interacts, this surge of LH interacts with FSH. And so notice now, top part of the upper box again, at the same time they're showing the LH surge, you're seeing an FSH surge as well, and an increase, still in number 4 on the table, an increase in progesterone concentrations also. So take a minute now, move down just before ovulation, and as FSH is increasing and LH levels are increasing, notice that progesterone levels, again, the upper part of the lower box of the B box, progesterone is also increasing. Back to the table, don't worry about these other specific things. So don't worry about prostaglandins, plasmin, proteolytic enzymes. Just realize that there are a number of different compounds, including LH and FSH and progesterone, which all interact to produce ovulation. Go ahead and find ovulation on the figure. And so lower part of the upper box. And again, right about day 14 now, you can see ovulation. You can see that secondary oocyte being released with the surrounding cells, with the surrounding nutritive cells of the corona radiata. Again, we're just following through now, so hopefully not trying to take a bunch of notes on this. Number 6 then, following ovulation, here, don't worry about specifically, these are follicular and thecal cells, but notice number 6 then, following ovulation, the corpus luteum forms. The corpus luteum, remember, is left behind actually. And so again, as we've talked about, when ovulation occurs, part of the follicle remains behind in the ovary as the corpus luteum. And notice now again, number 6, you should know that the corpus luteum now secretes estrogens and progesterone. Next we have, back to the table, estrogens continuing to stimulate uterine wall development. Uterine wall then down at the bottom. And again, notice that the thickness of the uterine wall continues to increase. Progesterone, back to the table, stimulates the endometrium to become more glandular and vascular. And notice now that within the thickening endometrium, we're seeing the blood vessels being shown more and more prominently. Back to the table again. And so now we have estrogens and progesterone inhibiting the secretion of FSH and LH. Here we're going back up to the top part of the figure, again looking at FSH and LH levels, and right around the time of where we're seeing the corpus luteum down below, we're not really seeing, the figure doesn't really show very well that those secretions of FSH and LH are declining. To number 6 then on the table, if the secondary oocyte is not fertilized, the corpus luteum degenerates, no longer secretes estrogens and progesterone. And so notice now, top part of the figure again, we're seeing the corpus luteum. Again, if there's not fertilization going on, the corpus luteum degenerates into a structure called the corpus albicans. And you're familiar with this from your previous work, your previous study. Number 7 then, as the concentrations of hormones from the corpus luteum decline, blood vessels in the endometrium constrict. And so notice now, down below the corpus luteum, you can see that progesterone and estrogen levels have peaked at about the time that the corpus luteum is active. And now, if you watch at the top, the corpus luteum starting to degenerate, you'll see that there is a decrease in the blood concentration of progesterone, and also then followed by a dip in the blood concentration, the plasma concentration of estrogens. Down at the bottom again then, still number 7, blood vessels in the endometrium constrict, and number 8, the uterine lining sloughs off, and this produces menstrual flow. And so take just a minute again and notice now and we're looking at the lowest of the 4 sequences, if you will, so the lower part of the lower box, looking again at the thickness of the endometrium. And again, notice now very close to the end of the 28-day cycle, we do have the uterine lining sloughing off and producing menstrual flow. Number 9 actually on your table then, the anterior pituitary is no longer inhibited and secretes FSH and LH. And so now we're looking at FSH levels at the top, we're looking at LH levels at the top, and notice these are starting to bump up just a little bit, not a whole lot really. And at this point, if you go down to the timeline at the bottom, notice we're right around day 28. The cycle has completed, and the menstrual cycle then repeats. And you can see then they are showing on the figure the first 3 days of this subsequent menstrual cycle. And so again, definitely worth coming back to this and studying it in a bit more detail and a bit more slowly than I just ran through it. And with this, we are done with chapter 22 on reproductive systems. Congratulations. If you're listening to this, you've come a long way. Sit back, take a break, pop a cold beverage, and this will be my last lecture for a while, I think. I'm assuming it's taken everyone a while to get here. So again, good job, and this concludes lecture 22.